but I wrote it down at some point. One way to grow your soul is by being present in your body. Another way is by expanding the heart. A third way is by quieting the mind. The shrewd person finds a way to work on all three at the same time. Still trying to figure that one out. But as we just enter into a time of silence, may we be present in our body. May we expand our hearts. And may we quiet our minds. As we do, sing, and dance. To introduce myself, I want to just start with two stories that serve as parables for how I understand soul or spirituality, or what Dr. King called the issues that matter most. And the first story comes from Southern California about a year ago. My partner Lindsay and I got the opportunity to teach our young nephews how to tie-dye. And we got to do a little bit of this, homemade tie-dye right here. As I look out, I see some of y'all grew up in the 60s.
Oh, yeah.
This is coming back. But we did it right in front of Lindsay's mom's place, who the nephews called Nani. So we lugged 5 big buckets out to the sidewalk, out to the street actually, and filled those with dye, with red, blue, purple, yellow, and green. And Riley and Mason gathered up all their old t-shirts and socks and tighty-whitey underwear, and we started going to work. And after about 30 minutes of this, Riley and Mason were all out of stuff. And so they started to tie-dye their hats and their shoes. and then all of a sudden, Riley and Mason were gone. And you know, I was pretty sure that their interest in this creative activity had run its course. They were probably on screens, inside, in the air conditioning, but I knew I was wrong as soon as I saw them come running outside with Nani's towels and bed sheet. And I also knew that Nani did not give them permission for that. So although I appreciated the passion and the creativity that they were bringing to the table, I had to put up a boundary, which is hard for an uncle to do, by the way. So when I think about this, this is a parable for my own spirituality. What my soul goal is to take 5 colors: love, justice, compassion, truth, and humility, and dye the entire world with it. And when it comes to that soul goal, I think it's impossible to get carried away with it. It's everything. But the problem that as I've experienced and as I've studied the world, the problem as I see it is that the world that we live in has watered down those 5 colors. With supremacy stories that base our worth and our identity on what we look like, on where we work, on who we love, and how we worship. 5 years before George Floyd and I were born 40 days apart, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. gave a speech in New York where he identified what he called the giant triplets of evil: racism, materialism, and militarism. And Dr. King basically assessed that these giant triplets are what's tearing America apart. ripping America apart. And also what I've learned and what we've all learned in here is that those giant triplets did not exist just back then. They exist right now too. And that those giant triplets of evil do not just exist out there, but they exist in here too. And that these giant triplets of evil are the imperial forces, the spiritual forces, maybe we would even call them demonic forces, that water down love, justice, truth, compassion, and humility. So I offer a second story. And this second story for me is another parable that helps me understand my own spiritual orientation and organization. In order to keep these colors deep and well-defined, I'm rooting myself in an ancient tradition well acquainted with creatively subverting imperial forces. The Hebrew and Christian scriptures were written and compiled by chronically oppressed people. And these texts are far from perfect, but they do offer some awfully creative stories about love, justice, truth, compassion, and humility. There is one gospel episode in particular that has become a kind of second parable to explain my own spiritual orientation. It is the one where Jesus riffs off the manna miracle story in the Hebrew Bible. It's a story that says that Jesus collected 5 loaves and 2 fishes, and he fed a gigantic crowd of 5,000 poor and oppressed people. When everyone was done eating, Jesus told his disciples to gather up the fragments so that nothing may be lost. They filled 12 baskets full of broken pieces. So I kind of see this as a parable for my own life and how I understand my own spirituality, my own soul, what it means to grow it. That the loaf of Western Christianity, this tradition that I grew up in the suburbs of Southern California, and the American culture it curated has been ripped apart by racism, materialism, and militarism. For centuries, a critical mass of white Christians have done the exact opposite of what Jesus said and did. They counterfeited the manna miracle of divine abundance, and they turned it into a scarcity mentality. The loaf has been ripped apart by supremacy stories, but the good news is that broken pieces are left over and they can nourish us in our process of healing and recovery. The Jesus tradition, for me, is the basket that holds the broken pieces that nourish my spirituality. The basket is like an orientation, an organization. It gives me the language, the categories for the soul fragments that it holds. But let me be clear, Jesus was a Palestinian Jewish rabbi rooted in the tradition of the Hebrew prophets. The ancient Jews invented the prophetic vocation, an often inconvenient reminder that divine wisdom and wonder comforts the afflicted and afflicts the comforted. Jesus called the prophets the key to knowledge. It's why ruling elites conspired to kill Jesus, and it's why ruling elites have attempted ever since to turn Jesus into a purity code. So my religion turns on the command of Jesus to gather the fragments so that nothing may be lost. I'm bound to the task of reclaiming, reframing, redeeming, reconstructing what Western Christianity has watered down with racism, materialism, and militarism. I carry this biblical basket into the world and fill it with fragments that the giant triplets have separated me from, have broken me off from, have torn me apart from, have ripped me away from. I'm specifically referring to the broken, soul-nourishing pieces like my own ancestral lineage, deep way back. back when my ancestors were village people, before it was called Germany or Ireland or Great Britain. Like the liberation struggles of oppressed peoples. Like the tender, wounded, vulnerable places within myself. Like the land and its living creatures. Like people of faith and conscience from different spiritual traditions. And this is where I find so much resonance with you Unitarian Universalists. I'd carry my basket outside of Western Christian fold to find these soul-nourishing fragments so that nothing may be lost. So for the remainder of my time this morning, I want to share with you 3 different soul fragments that I've found outside the Christian fold that have defined and deepened love, justice, compassion, truth, and humility over the last 6 months since I got to be with you last. The first of those fragments that have nourished my soul are my Jewish friends, comrades, and rabbis who have invited me to organize meetings, to the streets, to vigils, to rallies, to marches, to advocate for the full humanity and dignity and protection of all of God's children, including the Palestinian people. They are not paying lip service to the plight of Palestinians, but these Jewish friends and comrades are demanding new policies that affirm them as divine image bearers, straight from their sacred scriptures, straight from the first page of the Hebrew Bible. These Jewish friends and comrades have taught me what it means to be a peacemaker. As many of you know, the Hebrew word for peace is shalom. And it has nothing to do with staying civil or steering clear of conflict in an aggressively unjust world. Shalom demands the health and harmony of the whole community. It cultivates collective liberation, the assurance that all God's children will be protected and provided for, no matter what we look like, where we were born, who we love, or how we worship. But of course, in order to make shalom a reality, much creativity is needed, because the levers of power and wealth are not just interested in promoting shalom, they are interested in the status quo, which is unjust and oppressive and violent. And so, about 3 weeks after October 7th, a Jewish rabbi by the name of Jake invited me down to a vigil in downtown Detroit out in front of our congressman's office. And I gathered there with a Jewish majority crowd, and a Jewish woman came up to the mic and read the names of 101 Palestinian children who were murdered in just one day. And then Rabbi Jake followed up by saying, in the Jewish tradition, one life is a whole world. And now if 40,000 lives have been taken, then 40,000 worlds have been destroyed. And over the last 6 months, I've repeatedly shown up in these spaces, and over and over, these Jewish folks come to the mic, survivors of the Holocaust, sharing their story and connecting their own experience with what is happening in Palestine now. Children and grandchildren of Holocaust survivors connecting their own ancestral lineage and their own ancestral strength to resisting and being in these spaces of liberation now. And it tugged at my soul. Because I am one of these white boys who really has no idea where I come from when I go back. And so a couple months ago, as I'm listening to these children and grandchildren of Holocaust survivors tell their story, I started digging and I found out that 5 of my great-great-great-grandparents were survivors of the Irish Holocaust. It's often called the potato famine, the potato blight. But as you dig into the history, you find out that the British, of which I have many ancestors as well, were pulling off all sorts of policies and using violence and using the army to export all of the Irish food and bring it over to Great Britain. And so my ancestors had to flee for their lives. And somehow, as I discovered this, what a soul-strengthening exercise for me. This is who I am. This is where I come from. And this ultimately is what connects me to poor, oppressed, marginalized people who I should never, ever turn my back on. Those are my ancestors that are calling me. The second soul fragment that has nourished my soul are, of course, Palestinian people who I've met at these same rallies and marches and vigils. Many of them Muslim women wearing hijabs, telling their stories. Muslim women like my Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib, Muslim women like Hesnia and Zainab, telling their stories. One Palestinian refugee, about my age, his name is Mike, shared his story out in front of the Farmington Hills City Council meeting just a couple weeks ago, and he said that 47 of his relatives have been killed in the last 6 months, and he said that his aunt and his 2 cousins are still buried under the rubble. I was at another vigil downtown earlier this month, and it was a vigil that was put on by 2 different Palestinian organizations in Dearborn. It was right out in front, I know many of you are familiar with downtown Detroit, right in front of the Spirit of Detroit, the Coleman Young building named after the first black mayor of Detroit. And they put on this vigil and invited doctors who had just returned from Palestine, from Gaza, to share their stories. These are American doctors. There was one doctor who drove down from Flint. He was actually working that day, but he was on call. He drove down from Flint. He had just gotten back from Gaza, and he shared this one story with us. He said that he was on the operating table all day, and he got a call in Gaza, and this person said, "Hey, you've got to come now." And he said, I'm on the operating table. I'm in the emergency room. What am I supposed to do? And he somehow got somebody to, take his place, and he left. And he came upon a situation of a young mother who was carrying a 3-month-old baby when an IDF missile hit the house right next door, and the blowback was so strong that it melted the baby to the mother's arm. And the doctor just couldn't believe what he was experiencing, what was in front of him. And of course, the woman survived amazingly, but he had to amputate the arm. And that night he had to bury the baby with the mother's arm. And the next day, after, of course, a whole night where the doctor could not sleep, tears, 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 he went out to find the woman. And when he found her, she was angry. And she said, "Are you the doctor that amputated my arm?" And the doctor was like, "Yeah, I had to do it." And the woman had a smile that came across her face. And she said, "I want you to know that my baby, 3 months old, has not stopped smiling since the day that she was born." And she said, "This is what I know, that when Allah raises my daughter, on that day, part of me will be raised with her. Now, I got to tell you, again, I'm a white boy who's been trained to be cut off from my feelings. But when I listen to these stories, it hits something. It hits a part of my soul that overcomes me. It overwhelms me. That kind of softness does something that nothing else can do. And it also is a kind of fuel that pushes me further. And I can remember the stories and the faces of the people that are telling these, and they are with me. And so it's connecting to these tender, vulnerable places deep, 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 deep within me. The Palestinians call this steadfastness, sumud. It is a word that I've learned in the last few months. The sumud of this Muslim woman, this Muslim woman who lost her child and is convinced that Allah is going to raise the child and her along with her child. Sumud, steadfastness, standing firm in the face of occupation, never surrendering humanity and dignity, no matter what other people say or do. And then the third soul fragment that I offer this morning, it is spring, and for the third year in a row, the red robins are building a nest on our back deck. And these red robins, there's the mama bird and there's the papa, and the mama is usually up there in the nest. And man, that papa is out looking for worms, and that papa is fierce. So when I'm just out there trying to, do a little reading or writing, papa like swerves and almost hits my face. And I was out there the other day and I heard all of this squawking, and all of a sudden I look up to the right and there's a red-tailed hawk up on the pole, right? And so the red robins are getting after it, and there's all sorts of other birds, including the crows. They call this mobbing, where they just start darting at the predator and doing whatever it takes to protect the young ones, to protect what's going on right there in their home territory. There's a pretty famous Bible verse where Jesus told the people to pay attention or to consider the birds of the air. Even though they do not reap or sow or hoard their stuff, they still have everything they need. For Jesus, the simplicity was the model, but I gotta tell you, when I experience these birds, it's more like a mob mentality. It is a mob mentality for love, justice, truth, compassion, and humility, coming together. And it's a reminder that I'm not in this thing alone. It's a reminder that when we band together and we form the union, and when we really have that kind of understanding, Dr. King called it the inescapable network of mutuality. When we realize that no one is free until we're all free, and we're in this, some really powerful things can happen. And so I want to close again with Dr. King. It's the spring, and I always think about this, in April. And April is when, in my opinion, my humble opinion, and April is when Dr. King wrote his greatest piece from the jail cell in Birmingham, right after he got arrested. Wrote it on the margins of a newspaper and smuggled it out for the world to read. And in that masterpiece from the cell, Dr. King said that we need creative extremists in order to bring love into the world. And so I don't believe that we all need to go out and get arrested like the leaders of the Black freedom struggle, or these college kids on campuses, these courageous, creative college kids on campuses, or any of these other justice struggles. But I do believe that we need to get clear about what the giant triplets of evil are doing, how they're ripping away our world. And I think we need to get creative about how we go out and we find those soul fragments and we get nourishment from them. And I think that when we seek and find and feed off of these broken pieces, we will recover the parts of ourselves that have been ripped away from us. And we'll recover things like a clear head, a soft heart, deep belly laughter, an uninhibited spirit, a camaraderie with others who are also committed to creatively constructing a world that works for everyone. And I believe that these things are worth hanging a whole life on. Amen? So we are going to sing our closing hymn.